So the notification just came on that the recording is going.
That we're recording? Oh, I see. Okay, great. All right, welcome everyone to the latest iteration of the online Peace Science Colloquium. I am your host, Brad Smith. I'm an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University. My co-host who will be joining in the future is Cassie Dorff. She's also an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University. We are, this colloquium is affiliated with the Peace Science Society, and our goal is to bring great research to all of you viewers year-round, not just at the meetings that are held by the Society. So this week, we're really excited to be hosting Brendan Cooley, who is a PhD candidate at Princeton University. He's going to be talking about a paper titled Gunboat Diplomacy, Political Bias, Trade Policy, and War. And we have an excellent panel of discussants today. First, we have Robert Carroll, who's an assistant professor at the University of Illinois. We have Andrew Coe, who is my colleague here at Vanderbilt University, also an assistant professor. And then finally, we have Erik Gartzke, who is professor and director of the Center for Peace and Security Studies at University of California, San Diego. So Brendan, the ground rules are pretty simple. You can presentation 15 to 20 minutes. And then with the rest of the hour, we'll turn it over to our discussants to have a nice conversation about your paper. So whenever you're ready, I think he's told you how to share your screen.
Yeah, let me see if I can do this real quick.
And I'll just give you a notice at like 5 minutes left when we've hit about 15 minutes.
Awesome, thank you. Can we see?
Oh, we can see.
Yes. Cool. Okay. So yeah, thanks, Brad and Cassie and Heason and the Peace Science Society for putting this together. Thanks to all the discussants for being here. I'm really excited to get their feedback. So we'll give a high-level overview here. The paper and slides are available on my website. This title slide, the paper's Gunboat Diplomacy. The title slide is a depiction of American Commodore Matthew Perry's landing in Yokosuka, Japan in 1853. He came bearing demands from U.S. President Millard Fillmore that Japan open its markets to trade with the United States. Of course, Japan was autarkic at the time and had no interest in liberalizing its markets, but Perry brought with him gunboats, which he parked in Edo Bay, and made it very clear that Japan would face consequences if it did not meet Fillmore's demands. So, this paper is about, hang on, make sure, there we go, about trade and war. And, the general way we think about trade and war, both, I think, in the public consciousness and in the academy, is that trade is a force for peace. In particular, we think of countries as fighting wars about sort of non-economic things, the territorial distribution between them, some sort of ideological conflict, these sorts of things. But when they're trading, there's this additional potential cost they have to consider. War might disrupt trade, and this is going to make them less likely to contemplate war. And while I put O'Neill and Russett up here as a sort of canonical example of this, and while a lot of scholars have taken issue with the way that they sort of link premise to conclusion, the logic of the argument, I think they generally adopt this paradigm of sort of thinking of trade as mediating in these pre-existing conflicts of interest. And what we see in the Perry expeditions is that countries are more than willing to contemplate war to pursue economic objectives. Around the same time, we saw Britain and France prosecute the Opium Wars designed to open Chinese markets despite Chinese recalcitrance. And more recently, we've seen Russia couple demands or couple threats made toward Ukraine with demands that they refrain from economic integration with the European Union, which would plausibly harm Russian economic interests in the country. And underlying these sorts of disputes is the fact that governments are mercantilist to some extent. So if you gave them control of the world trade policy regime, they'd like to reserve some right to protect their own markets while forcing liberalization abroad. When we put those sorts of governments into an interaction with each other, they're going to generate what I call market access externalities, which is simply that when I raise tariffs on foreign products, I push foreign firms out of my market. And to the extent that governments care about the interests of those firms, this is going to generate conflicts of interest between the governments. And we know that because there is no world police, that efforts to address these externalities can in principle include the use of force, as we saw in the Opium Wars. But these examples that I sort of enumerate above are really should be thought of as bargaining failures. And we know that the absence of war does not imply the absence of coercion. So this sort of coercive diplomacy over economic policy might in fact be much more common. So the theory I'm going to present today sort of has three elements, and the work is going to be kind of meshing them all together. At the bottom of everything, the kind of engine that's going to make the model run is a new trade version of the international economy. What this is doing for me is really just connecting trade policy choices that governments make into economic outcomes like trade flows, prices, and profits, and et cetera. And governments are going to care about these economic outcomes, but they're going to care about them differentially, and they're going to be, protection is going to be for sale in the sense of Grossman and Helpman, 1984. So governments are going to care about special interests at the expense of consumers. But this notion of bias that I'm going to employ also kind of features in the selectorate model of Buonarroti et al., or you could also think of the political bias model of Jackson and Morelli. And we're going to take these governments and we're going to embed them in a really standard coercive bargaining framework, and we're going to, sort of see what we get out of this world. And the results, at the highest level look something like this. We're going to see that the most liberal governments are going to prefer to adopt free trade policies when left to their own devices, and this is going to mean that they're going to experience very small conflicts of interest. And in fact, we're going to be able to find types of governments such that the conflict of interest is so small that they're never going to want to fight wars. And in this world where the shadow of power is basically off the table, trade is going to be increasing as I make the governments more and more liberal. Now, when they get sufficiently mercantilist, power is going to be sort of back on the table. And powerful countries are going to be able to use their military power to resist demands for liberalization from abroad. And this means that powerful countries are going to be more protectionist in equilibrium. And we're going to see that trade and peace are going to be sort of correlated in equilibrium, but there's no sense in which trade is causing peace. What's doing the work is this variation in the level of mercantilism of the governments, which is causing trade and war propensity simultaneously. Okay, so what does this model look like in more detail? So we have two governments that are going to be bargaining over a pair of tariffs, one that I'm going to adopt and one that a foreign government's going to adopt. And their payoffs are going to depend on the international economic effects of these tariffs. The economy is going to have a mass of firms producing differentiated products, and consumers are going to want to have cheap access to as many varieties of products as they possibly can. So you can think of these as like Toyotas and Fords. And American consumers, in principle, would like to, different consumers would like to consume Toyotas, and some, want to consume Fords given the same prices. But Ford would like to keep Toyota out of the domestic market, and vice versa for Toyota in Japan. So this is going to kind of create the market access externalities that I've been talking about. And governments are going to place differential weight on the special interests, the preferences of Ford versus the interests of consumers that want low prices. And this is going to lead to a tension in trade policy that's going to be resolved depending on sort of which of these elements governments weight more. And the sort of tweak to the standard, international bargaining model that we're going to consider is that war is not going to result in some division of a fixed surplus, but rather it's going to result in regime change. So when I win a war, I earn the right to basically change the preferences of the government that I'm bargaining with, and impose, and through that change in preferences, impose openness. And we're going to examine sort of how that changes this environment. So to fix ideas before we kind of go into the political economy, the bargaining environment is quite standard. We were just sort of adapting it to this trade policy world. So an offer in this world is going to be a pair of tariffs, one for me, country I, and one for the foreign country J. Home's going to make a take it or leave it offer, but they're not going to be sure about the value of foreign's cost of war, which are going to be held privately. So this is going to generate the specter of war under some parameter specifications. And an equilibrium in this interaction is just a pair of strategies, one for the foreign country, which is just a mapping between the offer that they receive from the home country and a choice of whether or not they want to accept that offer or go to war. That's omega star. And then given its expectations about whether the foreign country is going to accept that offer, home is going to optimally calibrate its offer in order to maximize its utility over the probability that it gets accepted versus the probability that it has to fight. And that equilibrium offer is going to be called tau tilde star. And really the sort of the work in this model is going to be to sort of microfound this G tilde, this government utility, in a political economy of trade. So, we're not going to dive too deep into the details here, but just to give you a sense of how the economy works and why it's important. Again, we're going to have this sort of massive manufacturing firms producing differentiated products. We can think about cars again. We'll be engaged in monopolistic competition. And the core things that are going to come out of this economy are the two functions that I have here on the bottom of the slide. So the first is the consumer's indirect utility over prices. And the second is the profits of the firms. Now, the consumers are going to benefit from low prices. So we see that the price index PI here features in the denominator of the V function, which means that higher prices are bad. And tariffs raise prices. So consumers want to keep tariffs as low as possible. Now, firms are going to care about their sales in the home market and abroad. So they'd like the home government to adopt a tariff that's as high as possible. Ford wants to keep all the Toyotas out of the home market so that it can sell as many Fords as it wants. But it also wants to maximize exports. So it wants Japan to liberalize as much as possible. And so if the firm was in charge of trade policy, it would, around the world, it would enforce maximum closure at home and openness abroad. And so the government, as I mentioned, is going to care about a mix of these two things, right? And this parameter A sub I is going to determine how much the government cares about consumers relative to producers. So as A gets really large, the government's going to behave as a welfare maximizer in the classical sense, but this pi function is going to be hanging out as an incentive for the government to adopt positive tariffs. And we're going to work in a world in which the government always wants to implement some protection, but we're just not sure exactly how much. So government preferences over their own trade policy look something like this. So on the x-axis, we have the home country's choice of trade policy. So autarky is all the way over to the right and free trade is over to the left. And we see that initially utility for the government is expanding as I push Toyotas out of the home market and increase profits for Fords. But eventually this comes at the cost of consumers and my utility falls. So the optimal ideal point for home's tariff is going to look like this. But as I make the government more mercantilist, I'm going to shift this curve outward. And they're going to prefer higher and higher tariffs. So this is the kind of core variation that we're going to explore. How does this affect the coercive bargaining setting? But of course, government utility depends not only on the policies that it adopts, but also on the policies that are implemented abroad. So here I'm going to plot basically government indifference curves through the policy space. So each of these lines is a set of trade policies that delivers a fixed level of utility for the home government. And we see that as we move sort of left to right, these inherit the quasi-concavity that we saw on the slide before in my own policy. But we're jumping indifference curves as we move from the top of the plot to the bottom, as we make the foreign government more liberal. So the top of this mountain is in the very middle, the bottom middle of this plot, and that's what the government would implement. That's what the home government would implement if it had complete control over its policy and the policy abroad. So, with an understanding of these interests, we can think about when I win a war, what type of government would I like to install abroad? And since I want trade barriers to be as low as possible abroad, I'm going to choose the maximally liberal government. And that's just this problem formalized here. And Proposition 2 says that the optimal puppet is as liberal as possible, because that's the kind of government that, when left to its own devices, is going to implement minimal trade barriers and maximize market access opportunities for my firms. And so once we've characterized what's going to happen in the wars, we can think about the sort of best and worst outcome of a war from the home government's perspective. So if I win, I'm going to get utility G upper bar, which is just my utility for my ideal home policy, and a perfectly open or a maximally open foreign government. But if I lose the war, of course, I'm going to get replaced by a maximally liberal government and have to suffer under that policy. And the foreign government is going to implement its ideal policy, and that's going to give me utility G lower bar expressed here. I'm going to define the home government's conflict of interest vis-a-vis the foreign government as simply the difference in these utilities, the difference in what I get in the best case scenario when I win a war and the worst case scenario when I lose a war. And it's probably not surprising that as I make the governments more and more liberal, that this conflict of interest is going to be decreasing. So we can think about the sort of extreme case where the governments are maximally liberal. So when left to their own devices, they're going to implement free trade. And then if they were replaced, they would be replaced by a maximally liberal puppet that would also implement free trade. So war basically delivers nothing in this world, and the conflict of interest is zero. And now as we move sort of away from that extreme point, we're going to make the governments more and more mercantilist. They're going to generate larger and larger market access externalities when left to their own devices, and this conflict of interest is going to be increasing. And this just sort of formalizes that intuition. So now that we know what happens in a war, we can think about what does the foreign government get if it comes to that. And we're going to let rho denote the probability that the home government wins. So for the foreign government, with probability 1 minus rho, they're going to win the war and get to implement their ideal policy, get utility G upper bar. And with complementary probability, they're going to lose, get utility G lower bar, and there'll be some cost Cj that they pay if war occurs. And now their reaction function can be characterized quite simply. So they're going to fight whenever their utility for war is greater than the utility that they get under Home's offer. And now, sort of moving to the results, we can think about what happens in a case where this conflict of interest is so small that it never exceeds the cost of war for the foreign country. And here, basically, war is pointless. It always delivers more costs than benefits for me as the foreign country. So I'll accept whatever offer is proposed. So from the home government's perspective, they're going to propose their ideal point. That'll be accepted by the foreign government, and we'll never get war. So what lemma 6 here says is that whatever lower bound on the foreign cost distribution you give me, I can always find a cut point type AJ of CJAI, such that all bias types of foreign government above that type will accept Home's ideal point, and the probability of war is 0. And we can sort of see this a little bit more clearly maybe in this figure. So the cut point here is in the middle of this distribution, AJ of CJAI, and for all governments that are less biased or more liberal than that government, we're going to be in what I call a zone of peace. And now, if we think about what happens when I make the home government more and more liberal, well, in this case, when left to their own devices, their ideal point is not so bad from the foreign government's perspective. So the set of types who are going to accept Home's ideal point is going to be increasing as I make the home government more liberal. And that's what proposition 4 here says. And now within this zone of peace, when I make the home government more and more liberal, I'm going to be decreasing the barriers, that the trade policy, the level of tariffs that it chooses to implement at its ideal point, and this is going to increase trade between the two governments. So within this zone of peace, we sort of establish a dual liberal peace and liberal trade. Now, on the left-hand side, when we're on the other side of this cut point of AJ, then the shadow of power is going to in part dictate trade policy outcomes. And now here, the home government is going to face a sort of standard risk-return trade-off when calculating the policy it would like to propose to the foreign government. Any policy, as I move closer and closer to my ideal point, I get higher utility conditional on peace, but I run a larger risk of war. So we can write the probability of war as a simple function of the foreign country's war value and its utility for the offer. We can calculate Home's war utility in the same way that we did for foreign's. And then the induced objective function for the home country when considering the offer is just the probability that its offer is accepted times its utility at that offer, plus the probability that its offer is rejected times its utility for war. And now, if we think about what happens when I make the government stronger, increase rho, I'm making it more and more likely that when war occurs, it gets to implement its ideal point. So this is going to make it more belligerent in a sense in the bargaining game, and it's going to mean that the policy that it proposes is closer and closer to its ideal point. So this means that the home country is going to become more and more protectionist as I give it more power. And so this sort of highlights the endogeneity of trade barriers themselves, and then the trade that follows from that to the international distribution of power. Okay, so what do we learn from this exercise? So I think the most important move here is to recognize that globalization is not endogenously given. Rather, governments make choices. They choose trade policies that affect trade flows in the international system. And I think what the model highlights is that the same forces that push them to liberalize their trade policy and increase their level of economic integration also reduces incentives for conflict. And in this sense, the sort of relationships that we might observe in the data between trade and war might be traceable to the same sort of primitive of interest. And I think in one sense, this turns our attention toward, policy liberalization rather than economic exchange as a sort of more proximate cause of conflict. And this is sort of supportive of the literature, which I think Pat McDonald's work comes to mind, that looks at, trade policy measures such as tariffs as a better indicator of conflict propensity than trade itself. But as I showed you in Proposition 6 on the last slide, these trade barriers are themselves endogenous to the distribution of power in the international system. So there's no sort of like neat mapping between the regression of policy liberalization on war propensity isn't necessarily isolating that direct effect. And I think the other thing that this highlights is that the source of foreign policy belligerence in the model is coming from these firms who really want to impose large externalities on foreigners. And I think when you look at Ben Fordham's work here comes to mind on sort of the political economy of U.S. security policy, and he traces out that a lot of that firms are seeking to access or seeking to influence the government not only on its commercial policy choices, but also on how it uses force. And that force can be an instrument for achieving market access abroad. And so I think these sorts of things are consistent with the setup of the model. And then sort of, turning to the international political economy literature, again, equilibrium policies depend on both governments' preferences and the distribution of power in the international system. So when we observe trade policies, we don't learn directly about the underlying government preferences that generated them. So there's in a sense an observational equivalence between what a powerful and liberal country would adopt versus a weak and mercantilist country, where the weak and mercantilist country is liberalizing because it's under threat, whereas the powerful and liberal country is liberalizing because that's what it wants. So untangling these things is, I think, and focusing on the sort of coercive bargaining and IP is an important avenue for future research. And the sort of last thing I'd highlight is, in the war bargaining literature, we focus overwhelmingly on explaining wars as a function of variation in bargaining frictions. And I think when you sort of mount a very standard political economy of trade into the bargaining model, you recognize that variation and conflicts of interest are really important in determining whether governments want to fight with one another in the first place. So Bills and Spaniel in the piece Policy Bargaining International Conflict, and Brad Smith as well, are already driving this train. But I think from the international political economy perspective, this reinforces the importance of taking conflicts of interest seriously. So that's what I have. I'm really looking forward to everyone's feedback. And I welcome any feedback at this email, and you can see the paper on my website. Thanks. Oh, shoot.
Sitting here talking to myself.
There we go.
Sorry. Thanks for the presentation, Brendan. So we've got about 35 minutes left for questions. So I'll try to keep track of the queue as it develops. But does anybody want to get us started?
Well, I've done one of these before, and the way it was done last time was that, and this I may have gotten it wrong this time, that we were asked to be to prepare formal discussion comments. So that's what I.
Absolutely. Yeah. So if you want to give those, that's great.
I have no preference for the order in which we go.
Okay. Yeah, Erik, if you want to start us off, that's great.
Well, I want to thank Brennan for, I think, a really sophisticated, interesting, and somewhat provocative paper. I remember a dictum that Jim Morrow and Alistair Smith love to repeat about how if you don't have anything bad to say, you shouldn't say anything at all. So I will try to, no, I'm not going to say anything bad, but I'm going to suggest some things that I hope will be helpful in, some of this is presentation and some of this is content, and I'm not sure what the mix is. You can hear our nation's defense flying over my head as we're speaking. They're enforcing free trade around the world right now. Okay. So a couple of things, and I'm just going to go in the order I wrote them down, which happens to be in the order of the paper. That's not in order of importance. I think the abstract, this is very trivial, but the abstract implies, I thought you were going to give me some empirics, and this is a model, and it's a good model, and it's perfectly legitimate, but maybe make it clear that what this is a theoretical exercise from the outset, so that nobody starts to think they're going to be exposed to something they're not going to be exposed to. Moving along, the examples that you give actually provide some tension that I think runs through the whole paper. The 19th century examples are examples where imperialist powers went abroad and imposed new terms of trade on a foreign power, like the black ships in Japan. They didn't change the regime type of the foreign nation. They simply forced them to open trade. And when you get to the modeling phase, it's a bit semantic how you label the terms in the model. And you could simply relabel them as opening to trade and say nothing about regime type, because regime type's not important in this model. It doesn't matter. In fact, some versions of a model like this might consider the fact that by liberalizing the politics of a foreign power, you make it harder to cement terms of trade that are advantageous, because some future election might put a new government in charge that says, well, that's what they said, but not, what I said. We're dealing right now with that kind of dynamic in the U.S. The president of the United States says, yeah, 60 years, whatever, but I have a different understanding of how I want to conduct affairs. Right? So why get into that additional layer of trouble? Just talk about the terms of trade. I think there was a two-finger on it.
Yeah, but you can keep on going. I was just getting myself in the queue with Brad.
Okay. So there are a variety of things like this. I think that the model is in some ways too narrow, and in other ways too detailed and specific. The basic claim that one can make in this kind of setting is kind of simple, which is everybody likes somebody else who's more like them. And a government with power can impose a whole bundle of conditions on a foreign power to make it more like them. It doesn't have to be just in trade. It could be in their foreign policies. It can be in their domestic politics. It can be in any number of things. And then you get a story about how regime type is an endogenous feature. And in fact, that's where some of the literature is going. But if you broaden this to talk about regime type, then I think you have to talk about the democratic piece a little bit. And that's something that's a whole bundle of wax that you may or may not be interested, but that's something to consider. Why do we assume, there are different things you can assume about the structure of the domestic political economic system. Consumers are pro-labor, presumably. They're not just consumers. And depending upon how you treat their value for their labor, you can also want them to protect labor-intensive goods. And then you can get a protectionist economy in a democracy. And there's a lot of labor economics that sort of deals with that. it's also not clear that some of the other empirics, like an illiberal state. I mean, the example of Ukraine is a good one. It's not clear that illiberal states are well explained. These are the dogs that didn't bark in the model. Shouldn't they still want liberal trade partners that let them? I mean, this is liberal hypocrisy, right? I don't want to lower my trade barriers, but I want you to lower your trade barriers. So whether the state is liberal or not, it benefits having liberal partners.
Yep.
That doesn't look at all like the history of illiberal foreign policies around the world. The Soviet Union didn't say, let's go have free trading states. They wanted states that weren't free trading. They wanted states that were dependent upon them exclusively. So I think some of the empirics get a little bit messy when you think outside of just liberal states. And it creates new riddles. Like, for example, how does Bretton Woods and MFN work in this setting, right? How does the cooperative, the carrot part of this work? Presumably what the US's hegemon should have done in the 1950s with half the world's economy was simply go around, conquer a bunch of states, make them liberal, but erect barriers to protect its own economy. That's not what happened. So there's a lot of, I think there's as many questions that are raised as answers. The final thing I'll say is I think that, and this is a shameless plug, I don't think that that the model actually demonstrates that there's no relationship between trade and conflict. It demonstrates that if you buy the model, that there isn't the relationship that literature has fixated on, which is the opportunity cost argument. In my own work, I've been critical of this relationship, and I've argued for a signaling argument. And if you're going to use a bargaining model, then it's a no-brainer to take that extent to talk about the signaling effect. And in fact, in this model, add pre-existing trade relationships, signal the cost that you have for contests, right? A costly prior stage in which you do something that is valuable to you. Everyone knows it's valuable to you, and you demonstrate you're the high-value type by exception. So you can use trade to reduce conflict even in this setting. You just can't use it in the opportunity cost format. You have to use it for some other mechanism. Thank you.
Right.
Great, thanks.
Yeah. So Brendan, did you want to respond to any of those before I think Rob maybe wanted to jump in?
I'd say really quickly, the one thing that's interesting that comes out of sort of writing down the political economy this way is that I actually don't necessarily want other governments to look like me, right? So as you mentioned later, mercantilist governments want to trade with liberal governments, right? So autocrats don't want to go abroad promote, like if you think autocrats are more closed, they don't want to go abroad promoting more autocracies, right? So there's I think for the regime type literature, it's not that I want to sort of promote my own regimes per se, it's I want to install regimes that are going to be liberal. And of course,
you want to install trade policies that look the way you want them to. There's nothing necessarily incompatible with doing that with liberal or illiberal regimes. It's simply a function of the imposition of power. You coerce somebody into doing things that may or may not be what they want to do, but what you want. I think that's why the regime issue is a red herring for you. It's certainly a legitimate thing. And I think if you broaden the scope of this to talk about a whole bundle of issues that states might care about, then regime becomes more relevant. But you're better off just focusing on you want to impose your favorite Tao on the other side, and that's it. And you don't care about what regime they are.
That's great. Helpful. Thank you.
All right. Rob?
Yeah, I mean, so something I had planned on talking about that related to what Erik was talking about, I don't quite know what liberalism means here. And Erik is obviously better versed in this than I am, but so there's the democratic side, there's the regime type side, along with the what is the preference of the government side that you're talking about here. But part of what makes liberalism that's of interest here, to me anyway, is the role of private ownership. And that's glossed over here. So the firms are things that are not people, but we have models of private ownership economies for a reason. And it seems interesting to me to think about liberal governments as those that have well-established private ownership economies, or maybe not. You could imagine some variation in that, where this exacerbates the tension in terms of what the government's preferences are, right? Because they've got to weigh not just these two things that are opposed to one another, but also have to weigh this role of private ownership, where the people that happen to be driving the profits are also people that have regular citizen type preferences as well, right? And so liberalism is a difficult balance that has to be struck then at that point in time, because it's not just about regime and it's not just about representatives of the government, right? It's about sort of being able to keep your finger on the pulse about how ownership is at work with this. And this is straight out of Smith, right? So the received wisdom that you talked about here was, it's not, if the received wisdom at the time that those things were written was that trade is a force for competition and potentially could get out of control, right? And so Smith tells us that private ownership of firms is a liberal cause of war, because this could cause all sorts of interest group politics kicking in, much less the public debt problems, right? So those are the two primary Smithian reasons for trade and war, but sort of one of them is, what's the relationship between the private interest politics you're trying to get right here and the ownership in the economy in question, which is sort of a necessary ingredient for going to get liberalism all the way right. And so so this would be a cheap shot if it weren't for the fact that I think it's pretty easy to incorporate both into the incomes, right? So you need to be able to not just put tax revenues and wages into the incomes, but also profits through some exogenously given private ownership structure. And then also in terms of trying to balance what the accompanying preferences, so that would influence V and pi sort of indirectly in ways that might make this tension move a little bit slower. The A tension might not move as fast as you're having it move right now. You see what I'm saying?
Yep.
I don't think it's moving that fast, because I think the private ownership is mitigating this influence. And this is part of the tension that separates the Smithian types from the Schumannian types, right? So if you get this right, this is super interesting and adds all sorts of intrigue on the front end in terms of trying to get the liberalism really right. But in the absence of getting the liberalism really right, you're going to have cantankerous people saying, let me pull on this string, because when you say liberal, I don't know what you mean by liberal. And here you're going to say, I'm going to get liberalism so right.
Yeah. Brendan, did you want to respond?
No, that's great.
Okay. I think Andrew has a two-finger.
I just wanted to follow up on what I've heard so far. So, it seems to me like the danger with a paper like this is that in writing it, and certainly in having other people read it, the temptation is to want it to kind of explain everything, right? So I want to know about why some particular government promotes a certain type of government somewhere else. I want to know about why they are interested in particular commercial policies of that government. I want to know about how much of this is being accomplished by causing an existing government to change its policy versus trying to get that government replaced with one that will just prefer to set the policy you want. I think it's dangerous to try to satisfy those questions in a single paper. I think it would be easier to not only to finish this and get it out, but also to have it accepted by people if you're actually defining what you're doing in a slightly narrower way. So this paper is not going to answer everybody's questions about how the system of property ownership affects foreign policy preferences, about how particularities of regime type affect foreign policy preferences. You're taking on a narrower question, which is, what are my preferences over my trade policy and every other country's trade policy? And how's that affected by a particular aspect of what the government looks like, which is, how does it weight the profits of firms against the interest of consumers? And I think to the extent that early on in the paper you can kind of draw a box around what you're doing and say, this is what I'm doing. And, it's up to further research by me or others to figure out how these other things matter and how they play into the story. And because I'm only looking at a part of this, there are going to be lots of phenomena to do with commerce and war that this model does not explain. And it should be, you're going to be able to find empirical examples that don't fit the predictions of this model. But the idea is just, this is one mechanism that's going on, and it's theoretically coherent, and it's empirically plausible, and we can find at least some empirical examples that seem to match up with what it says should be going on. So I think, lowering people, I don't want to be too cynical about this, but lowering people's expectations a little bit about exactly how many of their burning questions about the relationship between economics and war you're going to answer would be a good thing. Answer those bigger questions in your book, right? Or subsequent papers or whatever it's going to be.
So I think Erik had a add-on comment.
I'm trying to boil this down. I think we're all pointing in the same direction. Let me try it this way. The basic mechanism that you're championing is very simple and very general. And it's one that I think everyone will buy into, which is, if you don't disagree, you don't fight. And one way to stop disagreeing is to beat up the other side and make them like you. Okay? But then you want to apply it in a particular context, and that makes perfect sense, right? But I think in doing that, you kind of stumble a little bit over slightly more general language. You don't need regime type here, right? Your examples actually illustrate this very well. In the 19th century, the US and the British didn't go around liberalizing countries and making them more democratic. They went around beating them up and making them change their trade policies, full stop, right? And that's what you want to talk about. That's what your examples say. You can note in an aside that, hey, this might apply in lots of other contexts, but I'm going to talk about trade right now, okay? The endogeneity of preferences is a more general thing. And actually, I've written on the effects of preferences and conflict, and others have as well. Those might be worth citing it to derail criticism and say, if you doubt that being like one another is useful for peace, then go fight with these people, not me. I'm going to assume it, and I'm going to show you a mechanism that gets us there. And then I think and the secondary thing that's going to get you into some difficulty is the model it has that classic property of being cute. There's a lot of moving parts that you may not need, and a modeler or somebody who is willing to wade through it a little bit starts looking at things and going, why do you do it that way? Is that necessary? I don't like that. You want to strip it down to as simple as possible to make this point, which is a very compelling point, which is, if I can make the other side look like me, I don't need to fight with them anymore. Full stop.
So I think Rob had a thought, but I want to jump in really quick because I agree with Erik's thoughts. So I know you mentioned the Will and Peter's work and some of the stuff that I've been doing with them on preferences, and I had a very similar reaction to your discussion. Just the use of the term regime type. I think that kind of makes me think about, well, sure, you change trade policy, but then what else changes as a result? And you're sort of implicitly assuming here that we can treat policy preferences, things like that of a government as fixed when we're changing these trade policy preferences. And I think that's totally fine. But I agree. I think you could, I think most people who are working in formal models are going to be okay with those kinds of all else equal, and that's just gonna set like a scope conditions. And I agree. I think you could do some work to pare down some of the technical stuff and put it in an appendix. I think you could, I think this model is not too far from the simplest setup that gives us what we want, but I think you could go a little bit farther, and I think that would increase the readership. So I just wanted to kind of echo those, because those were thoughts I had as I read through. I'll turn it over to Rob.
Yeah, I mean, so just there is a version of this paper that is here's a political economic endogenization of preferences, and it exacerbates a well-known and extant cause of war, Pawel 99, right? Um, that version of the paper is fine. It doesn't have the word liberalism in it, right? It doesn't have a lot of things in it. It's just a straight political economic, and that's probably pragmatically the best story you can do. Um, this could be quite a bit simpler, I think, in terms of the manufacturing sector, but we can talk about that maybe elsewhere. Um, there's also the general equilibrium version of the model that sort of gets all this as general as possible, right? And this isn't that, and you know that. So and given that you're probably not going to get that, you probably ought to go the pragmatic direction, right? And hone in and go. But once you're epsilon partial, be partial, right? Because it is unsatisfying from a GE perspective, right? Which is fine because nobody cares about GE.
Except for
right?
you.
So except for me. So like, I think that's totally reasonable, and there's a couple of interesting quirks going on in each of the domestic economies that could be abstracted away from, right? So like, some of the things that you're borrowing from in terms of the agricultural sector needs to be sufficiently large, and we're talking about some massive of these differentiated goods. This could be super simple, right? This could be way simpler. I think that you've presented this about as simply as you could, and if you put anything else in the appendix that is currently in the main text, already things have been obfuscated quite a bit. So I think probably simplify, partial. And don't cite any GE people early in the hopes of getting a GE referee, because then the GE referee says, why isn't this GE? But this isn't GE right now. It's semi-GE.
Okay, so we've got Andrew and then Erik had a comment.
Yeah, so I agree. In principle, I agree with this last comment from Erik and from Rob, but I would go further. So I would suggest something more radical in terms of simplification. It seems to me that, well, let me put this two ways. So the first way to say this is that put yourself in the reader's position. Either I'm a reader who's familiar with new trade theory, or I'm not. If I'm familiar with new trade theory, seeing you crank through all the machinery for it and the formalism doesn't really do a whole lot for me, because you don't actually modify new trade theory. Like, you're sort of taking new trade theory as it exists as a base and building something that's politically interesting on top of it. So the guy who knows new trade theory is not edified by seeing it done. The person who doesn't know and isn't familiar with the new trade models sees all of this machinery get built up and says, I'm not sure I completely understand it. It's not fully legible to me. I can't tell. I become suspicious that, like, you're cooking the books somehow, that there's something going on in there that's generating your results, but I can't quite put my finger on it. And I think you could seriously increase the audience and the impact for this paper if you took all of the economic micro foundation and put it in the appendix. And in the main part of the paper, what you said is, I need the following things to be true about the preferences of the actors in my model. Mm-hmm. I need consumers to favor free trade everywhere, firms to favor free trade abroad and protection at home, and governments to be somewhere in between the interests of consumers and firms. Yep. And everything I'm going to tell you that's political comes from those assumptions. Those are, on the face of it, empirically plausible assumptions. And you can say, for those who want to know exactly what justifies those assumptions, I've provided one possible micro foundation of that based on new trade theory. See the appendix for the details. And I think the nice thing about that is that it doesn't just make the paper easier to read for a broader audience. It also makes clear exactly what is it that you get out of the micro foundation that you need for your political conclusions. So, like, you could get those preference properties out of a number of different micro foundations. And I think that's important for you, in part because the fact of the matter is that, like, trade before World War II, and especially before the 20th century, doesn't really look like the models in the new trade theory, right? Like, the volume of trade that's in differentiated goods is pretty small before the 20th century. But I don't think, that shouldn't matter at all for your results because they don't really depend on that particular micro foundation. They just depend on these very plausible assumptions about consumer and firm and government preferences. So I think you could do a lot of good for the paper by just excising that stuff and just giving us the bottom line that comes out of it.
I think Erik was next.
I wrote in my notes Rube Goldberg. And I think it's one of these things. It reads like an economist trying to study political science, because there's a lot of interesting but unnecessary moving parts. And economists really, really hate when we strip that stuff out. But the truth of the matter is, it doesn't actually drive the results of the model. Whereas a simpler version, you can get the same thing. What I wanted to say was actually, I think it's also not the framework that you set up is also not necessary. There's another way to get the similar comparative statics, I believe, which is just think about it this way. What drives conflict in this bargaining model is asymmetric information about the cost of war, right? So anything that interdicts that is going to shape the probability of war. And there are 100 ways you can do this. But for example, tell me a story about how you're going to have a liberal trading regime in which you don't learn more about the preferences of the other party, right? So you can kind of just get it by saying that there's these mechanisms that coincide with trade that have nothing to do with trade per se. Like I get to show up in your port once in a while and I count the number of battleships you have, and I learned something that I didn't know otherwise, right? We didn't know much about Albania or China or the Soviet Union in the Cold War because we didn't trade with them and they didn't let us come visit them very often, right? So you can get this by endogenizing preferences, or you can get this by endogenizing information. And that's the real mechanism that's gonna drive this. And you could set it up in the way I suggest or some other way, or the way you did.
All right, we had Rob and then Andrew.
Yeah, I had a similar thought that sort of, this is a paper about the standard risk-reward trade-off, right? I'd be interested to know if you could write down an economic side that moved preferences that could cause war via a mechanism that wasn't this, because otherwise this is really just something about how domestic economics exacerbate the risk-reward trade-off, right? So if there's some other well-accepted casus belli, so if you do Jackson Morelli, that'd be easy, right? But if that's the case, it would be because otherwise, at the most stripped down level, this is just a paper about the risk-reward trade-off where I don't know your C and I got to move first, right? So I think I might be a preference outlier out of this bunch right now. It'd be neat to see sort of one domestic international economic environment that could cause war two ways, and say sort of, whether because otherwise Erik is so right that somebody, a referee that heaven forbid wanted to reverse engineer a review, right, would be able to say something like this is just lipstick on a very old pig, and it's very shiny lipstick and great, but that might be a nice workaround. Because otherwise, it really is just a very standard casus belli.
Andrew?
So yeah, I'm going to agree with Erik and Rob while disagreeing with them. So I agree with the view that what's new here is not the bargaining part. The reason why war happens here is a perfectly well understood. Well, you're not moving the understanding of why war is happening here further from various Pawel or Fearon papers. The thing that's new here, and I think the thing that makes the paper valuable and the thing that you should focus on in making your pitch for it is this is a way to connect something that's at the heart of scholarship on IPE, preferences over trade policy, to something that's at the heart of scholarship on international conflict, the balance of power, right? You're showing how these two things are related. And in showing how the two things are related, you're deriving new implications or new mechanisms for things we already think to be true about the relationships among conflict and regime change and trade policy. So, I wanted to kind of push in that direction. For me, I have to imagine that the scholars who read this, who aren't coming from the conflict literature, but are coming from IPE, are going to face this source of skepticism, which is that it's hard to think about contemporary countries choosing more liberal trade policies because they're afraid that if they don't, the United States or the EU or China or whoever is going to come and beat them up.
Trust me, they do say that.
Oh, I saw you present something like this at a conference, and of course, that's the first thing you got from the IPE people in the room. And I think there's a way to address that takes nothing away from your model, but will at least help those people to overcome their skepticism. So I think it's that there's nothing about your model or results that require that the outside option that's available to the two players be war, right? What you need to be true is that there's some outside option that offers some chance of permanently changing the trade policy of one or both countries, right? So war is sort of the easiest thing to imagine, but you could also imagine like more limited coercive uses of force that result in durably changed trade policies. You can imagine the more powerful side imposing economic sanctions, which, as we know, might lead to domestic destabilization of the target and regime change. You can imagine conditional offers of aid, which is going to be easier for more powerful states to make. We know, at least there's some evidence that all of these things can be effective instruments for causing governments to change their policies, and they all fit the model in my mind. And because they're all lower cost than like invading and occupying and changing a government, they're all easier for an IPE person to believe this is actually going on. So I don't know why you need to come down hard on the thing that I'm talking about here as war. You can still develop the empirical implications of thinking about what if the outside instrument here is war, but you could also develop those same implications for when we should see sanctions imposed, what kinds of conditionality we should see applied to offers of aid, that I think would really help you with that crowd. And I think the second thing, and then I'll shut up, that would help you with that crowd is you give some examples at the beginning. So you talk about, the U.S. Opening of Japan. You talk about a couple of others, but I really think if you want to overcome that skepticism, it would be good to bury people in empirical examples that correspond with what you're talking about. The more you can mention, and the more you can say, look, I'm not telling you the truth about this case. I'm telling you something that will help you explain what happened in this case, and it's not necessarily the only thing going on. So, for instance, is it the case that Iraq's economy is more open now than it was before? Is it the case that Afghanistan's economy is more open? What about Haiti, Panama, Grenada, the former Yugoslavian? Can you offer historical examples, say from the imperial era, that are more than just this one case, which is a little bit unusual because the U.S. is a somewhat unusual imperial power? Can you make statements about is the liberalism, the relatively open trade policies that we see today, is that around the world or in some regions more a function of regime change happened in the past, and so now these governments have liberal trade preferences, or at least in some places it more that we're seeing the impact of coercion, right? They're doing this because they fear that if they didn't, they'd be subject to outside penalization. I think that would all help to assuage the concern of this is an interesting idea and theoretically coherent, but I'm not sure I actually believe threats to use force to open trade are all that credible in a contemporary context.
So we're almost at noon. So I think Erik had one last thought, and then we'll let Brendan have a quick response.
I think one way to tighten this paper up is to take the title seriously. Literally, gunboat diplomacy was not about changing the regime type of the target state. It was simply imposing on them forcing them to open their markets to your goods, and typically just your goods. It wasn't liberalization. It wasn't open your markets to everybody's goods. In fact, one of the reasons the U.S. got involved in gunboat diplomacy in the 19th century was they were angry at the Europeans for not including U.S. goods in opening up these markets. So they started participating in saying, yeah, open it to us too, and sort of made the pitch that it should be a general policy, not just this country specific. Okay, so just approach it literally in the way the title says about gunboat diplomacy. Now, one of the problems in gunboat diplomacy is when you get liberalization and nationalism, there's pushback against it, right? And it becomes very hard just to go to a foreign country, point a trigger at the leader and say, give me what I want, because the public backs the leader up and says, no, 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 we're not going to bow to that. So then you get this splitting effect where either you have to live with the fact that some states are not going to do it the way you want them to, or you have to invade and change the regime. But that's a second paper where you explain why gunboat diplomacy, which was super popular in the 19th century, and you can explain, kind of fell out of favor, right? And what replaced it. So I would get all the regime stuff out of there. I would at least consider the suggestions we've made to simplify the model, because while those are interesting, they're not necessary for the results. And then you've got a very clean story about how, hey, sometimes force means you get to change things in a way that you're happy with, and then you don't have to use force anymore. So, yeah. And that's a real story I think people would believe.
All right, before we call it a day, Brendan, do you want to respond to any of the comments?
So I'm really intrigued by the sort of imperialism thread that's been running through Erik's comments, and I've actually considered an extension that's sort of in this realm. So I'd love to maybe just pitch that, and then we can maybe take feedback on it offline. But you're totally right that in the same economic framework, if we added a third country, what I'd like to impose on it is not liberalism, but openness to me and closure to everybody else, right? So so that world looks very much like 19th century imperialism. And of course, you don't necessarily have to go in and impose that. If you just sort of, if you're able to threaten the country enough, they may adjust their policies to reflect that latent threat, right? So I think that's a sort of interesting model of imperialism, and in a sense, the extension is very close to the model. It would not require a lot of work to extend the model, but then I'm adding some empirical content that may make things messier than they already are. So I guess I'd be curious about your all's impression about that, but we don't have to go down that avenue now. We can maybe talk offline. But that's really all I have. Thank you, everyone, for the comments. This is really, really helpful.
I'd also recommend citing Jim Morrow's 1999 JPR piece, which makes this claim specifically, that there's an endogeneity between preferences to trade, and that's why trade doesn't cause.
All right. Well, I wish we could
nice a model as you do, but yeah.
It's a very nice model. All right. Well, I wish we had more time. This is a great paper, Brendan. I want to thank you for sharing it with us. I look forward to seeing it out. I want to thank Rob, Erik, and Andrew for joining us, giving great feedback. I think it really gave us a lot of interesting stuff to think about. So if you'll join us for the next OPSC, I believe is going to be on December 6th, and we'll have Andres Gannon, who is a PhD candidate at UCSD, presenting really interesting work. Yes. That's right, one of Erik's students, presenting some really interesting work on alliance politics, which is right up my alley, so I'm very excited for that. The title of the paper is Use Their Force, Interstate Security Alignments, and the Distribution of Military Capabilities. So join us for that. And until next time, thanks.
Okay. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Brendan.